Chapter 591 End by Hydesgrain. Something within Jason seals his bloodline, and he has no idea what exactly it is. Apparently, it has to do with his mother, but that doesn't make sense to me. He doesn't even know what kind of race the Celestias are either. Whis simply exposed everything Jason had told him in secret without caring about anything, but that was exactly what Jason had expected. Since Whis had mentioned his master, Jason was fully aware that Whis didn't have the authority to make his own decision. This was only logical because every being below the age of 50 was seen as a youngling, and that was according to the common race's perspective. Higher-ranked races had probably an ever higher age limit to decide whether someone was still a child or had already matured. In the end, this didn't matter, and it was only Wiss's helplessness that had caused Jason to smile when he had left the apartment. Whis was not sure what he should do with the halfling, but somehow he'd felt obliged to help, now that Jason had revealed his secrets to him. Just what kind of mess have I jumped into? He cursed himself inwardly, only to hear that his master had forcefully suppressed her shock. If possible, bring him to me. According to what you said, he never left Argos. As such, he doesn't know what kind of trouble it will cause if he tells other races that he is a halfling of the Celestia race. Either they will revere him, or they will try to dissect him, maybe they would even sell him to other races as a slave, who knows. Maybe, we will be able to calm down the chaos if we help Jason to grow, or we might somehow intensify it, nobody knows. After that, Leia turned serious as she added, "If you think that we cannot trust Jason, kill him. Right now you can still stop him, and if you don't trust him, or think that he is evil, don't hesitate." Even though his master told him that, Whis couldn't help but smile dryly. Evil? This naive youth. Master, let me be honest, if Jason is evil, I wouldn't know if there are any kind beings in the universe. Whis was exaggerating right now, but his opinion about Jason's ideals was extremely high. He had heard some rumors about Jason, the halfling, even before he had encountered him. As such, Whis was fully aware of what Jason had to face and overcome the moment his existence had been exposed to the world. Wiss's life hadn't been easy either, and it was only because of his master that he had become the person he was now. However, Jason had achieved everything on his own. Having asked the young man many questions, Whis had been able to comprehend how Jason's life must have been. Yet, at the question of whether his identity had already been exposed before the Liberation Tournament, Jason had only smiled lightly while revealing that he had indeed exposed himself. This had a deeper meaning as he had been lecturing the human race about the entire truth of Argos and the insignificance of their race. Because of all the information Whis received, he couldn't believe that Jason was still determined to protect the race that had wanted his death, and that he wouldn't change his mind, even if he would attempt to persuade him. In the end, their opinion had changed about Jason, but Whis was still astonished about the young halfling. Even after what he has overcome, Jason wants to prevent another infiltration of other races in Argos, while helping the Olympus Federation to make ties with the human race that had abandoned him when he needed their trust the most. So, yes, I think we can trust him. Even though Whis couldn't be certain of Jason's trust, this was not problematic yet. Furthermore, his master would still be stronger than Jason once they encountered each other. At least it was unlikely for Jason to suddenly become much stronger, allowing him to break through several stages at once. The possibility was even less in the short time it took to use the multitude of world bridges to emerge on Tagran. At that moment, the connection of the emergency long-distance messenger crystal started to dim, indicating that the time for which they could talk was coming to an end. As such, Leia made her final decision, while avoiding revealing that she was both afraid and curious about Jason, the halfling of the human and Celestia race. According to your words, I can be relatively reassured that there won't be an issue for the time being. That means as long as he doesn't turn into an infernal Celestia, everything should be fine. All right, help him as quickly as possible and return to Tagran with him. I feel like a storm is brewing up, and I don't want something to happen to you. Whis nodded his head before he bid farewell to his master as the connection with her was cut off. Only a moment later, the tension in Wiss's body was released at once as he looked at his trembling hands. Aren't I a true dragon? How come I'm so afraid of the future? Shouldn't I be hopeful? While Whis was trying to return to his old, confident and prideful self, ignoring the devastating facts Jason had revealed to him without batting an eye, the Liberation Tournament had already continued. There were only 6 participants left, and Jason was one of them. His cultivation base was the weakest, but that was not important as his strength was the highest. Yet, instead of focusing on the last 2 fights he would have to win in order to be rewarded the lesser Origin Flame Crystal, Jason's mind was somewhere else, far away from his physical being. Jason was currently thinking about Wiss's reaction after he had revealed the fact that he originated from the Celestia race. At least, he owed half of his origin to it. While trying to make sense of the reaction and the answer Whis had given to the questions he had asked, Jason didn't even notice that everyone was called into the arena. The first fight would start soon, and now only one fight would be held at a time, allowing the spectators to focus on each fight. Normally the Liberation Tournament's final fights would be recorded and analyzed. However, that had already happened with the first battle royale Jason had fought in. His fight had been the most interesting to analyze for the Olympus Federation's academies because it had been the most exciting part of the entire battle royale. The other rounds of the battle royale had also been recorded, and they would most likely be used in order to evaluate the God's children's strengths and weaknesses. Jason would normally be interested about how exactly the Olympus Federation would evaluate and analyze everything, but that was not something he could be bothered about right now. Chaos Dragon, Tagran, takes care of halflings with talent and repulsive energies. Wiss's reaction when I told him about my origin, Celestia race, soul fraction of a mysterious beast with the chaos attribute within me. Blurting everything that was on his mind helped Jason to momentarily ease his troubled mind, but it was extremely confusing. As such, he tried to distract himself by fighting against his opponent with all his might. Fusing with Petri, Jason simply utilized everything except the abyssal effect of his Emperor Eyes in order to strengthen himself, while weakening his opponent. Unfortunately, fusing with Petri and using his curses to the fullest while exerting Solaris Flame without restraint helped him defeat the Dragonute he had been paired to fight against in their first clash. Khan had been much stronger than the Dragonute he was matched against, and Jason could only sigh, thinking that he should have been paired against someone like Zyna. With that, he would be able to distract himself, and have no time to think about the bulk of information Jason had yet to digest. Despite his hope, Jason had been betrayed by the last fight of the Liberation Tournament. His opponent was Aran at the 9th Lig stage, which was extremely high for a descendant of a common race, on the mana-scarce planet Argos. This caused Jason to be slightly happy, which made him use the exact same tactic he had utilized in the fight before. A fusion with Petri, his curses fully utilized, and Solaris unrestrained flames enveloping the black scales that had a golden vein-like pattern on them. Without holding back, Jason had exerted the floating sky movement technique, which caused his terrifyingly high speed to increase further, only to reach the Ran a moment after the final battle had started. After that, Solaris Flame devoured the prodigy of the Ran race, and slowly burned him, only for an elder to intervene. If not for the elder Ran who had prevented Jason, who was eager to fight someone strong, his descendant would have met his death at Jason's hands. As such, the final ended before it even began, with an extremely disappointing result for the spectators, and even more so Jason. Dejected that the fight ended so soon, he could only dissolve Petri's fusion as he looked at Jared and Zyna, who stared at him in shock. Maybe it is really time to think about leaving Argos. Chapter 592 Formalities by Hydesgrain. Even if his cultivation base was low, his combat strength was almost at par with someone at the Prisma stage. Using his curses, the Emperor Eyes abyssal effect, and killing intent to merge everything together. Even those at the lower ranks of the Prisma stage's first threshold wouldn't pose him much of a problem as long as it remains a one-on-one battle. Thus, Jacen thought that he should no longer be restricted by Argos' scarce mana. I only have to save the Fleurs, question Nathan about what happened to my family, and then I'll destroy a few world bridges before bidding farewell to everything. Anna should be able to take care of herself, right? She has a new family after all. What Jacen perceived as, only, would cause a headache to others, but he could only smile lightly. He had won the last 2 rounds of the Liberation Tournament much more easily than he had expected. As such, he would receive the Crystal of a Lesser Origin Flame soon, and it was possible for him and Whis to leave after the celebration was over. Now that everything was over, Jacen was told to change into formal clothes instead of the combat suit he had been wearing during the last few days. After only a short lunch break, the human embassy and the authorities of the Olympus Federation started a meeting to discuss the exact clauses of their agreements. In the end, the most important was the peace agreement and the sharing and distribution of world bridges. Mankind might be weaker right now, but they could be nurtured quickly and turned into a batch of helping hands that would allow the Olympus Federation to increase the resources they could procure from other world bridges. As such, there shouldn't be many problems. At least, that was Jacen's opinion as he put on the clothes he had been given by Merle. It was a seemingly ordinary black suit with a long jacket that was embroidered with several badges, giving Jacen the status of a temporary higher echelon of the human race's government. This was pretty interesting, but not enough to bother him anymore as his mind was already fully set on his adventure to other planets. There was so much he could see, and according to Whis, the Ascendian stage was considered to be a stage every common race could reach. Only then it would become slightly more difficult for the races with a weak mana aptitude to increase their rank and stage. It would serve as the starting line to differentiate the races according to the ranking Jacen had heard of. Initially, he thought that the ranking was mostly based on the ranks the different manuals a race possessed. However, that was obviously not the case because a race's mana aptitude, overall strength, the amount of land they had claimed, and so on were other important factors that contributed to the deciding factors too. Jacen's knowledge was limited because mankind couldn't teach him a lot about the vast universe. Rather, Jacen had taught them everything he knew instead. Other than that, the only vast stream of information he had received came from the library in Jano, where he'd spent more than a month, reading and absorbing knowledge like a sponge. This had allowed Jacen to learn a bunch of interesting facts that made him more knowledgeable than mankind. Unfortunately, this was not enough to be even close to the knowledge of beings like Whis, who were taught since their youth, knowledge Jacen could only dream of. The lack of knowledge might bother others, but Jacen saw this as an opportunity to bridge the knowledge gap and procure everything others had already learned. Acquiring knowledge was something Jacen liked to do, thus, instead of feeling discouraged, Jacen's determination grew stronger. As such, he was deep in thought and didn't even bother that Merle Arths was ascending in the air, pulling him with them, where they approached a small, yet extremely exquisite-looking building. Only when Jacen looked at it did he regain his senses as he blurted out, "An underground shelter." His emperor eyes perceived everything through energy fluctuations, and the mana radiating from the surrounding building complex was negligible in comparison to what he saw under the ground. Along with the authorities of the Olympus Federation, his eyes scanned the surroundings to take in the view greeting him. Jacen couldn't help but feel astonished after estimating the defensive capabilities of the materials used to build the underground shelter in addition to the profound runes that had been inscribed. The overlords at the second threshold of the Prisma stage would have problems breaking through these walls. Maybe, even Whis with his dragon fire. After this, his mind went on alert mode, and they entered the exquisite building that was protected by tens of Prisma stage guardians, in addition to traps that would be activated if invaders were to infiltrate the building. Aren't they a little bit too scared of being attacked? Jacen wondered, only to remind himself that the majority of races belonging to the Olympus Federation had been migrating races and that they had fled from something. As such, the wounds of their past might have healed but left behind ugly scars as memories. Thus, he refrained from commenting anything for the fear of coming across as an impolite brat. Passing the guards, the human embassy, including the God's children, and Jason entered the elevator that was the only object inside the entire building complex. The elevator descended into the ground and it took them less than half a minute before the elevator's doors opened once again, revealing a ginormous shelter, filled with the Olympus Federation's government. This astonished the others, while Jason, who had been aware of this, was able to retain his calm. Looking around, he scanned the mana cores of everyone around him thoroughly before he turned towards the secretary who rushed towards them. A secretary at the peak of the lick stage, not bad. Esteemed human embassy, I'm sorry for being late. I was told that your group would arrive later. I'm your assigned guide, and I am responsible for explaining the most important aspects about the universal mannerisms and code of conduct one has to follow in order to not be rude. When Jason heard this, he was immediately interested, only for Betty to tuck on his jacket. Translate please. Only then did Jason look up to notice that the others looked at him with a confused expression, which caused him to smile dryly as he translated everything perfectly. Because the universal language had many words that could be interpreted in several ways depending on the situation, Jason only translated the context without bothering about a word-to-word translation. This made everything easier for both sides, and the guide turned around once he had explained the basic etiquettes the human embassy had to pay attention to in order to not come across as rude. With the basics having been explained, the guide walked towards the direction in which Jason perceived hundreds of mana cores, including the mana cores of the higher echelons of the Olympus Federation. At that moment, Jason had a premonition, making him pray in his mind. Please don't let it be boring. Chapter 593 First Approach by Hydesgrain. After they had entered the banquet hall, Jason's premonition had been found to turn out to be correct. It was annoying, but Jason had to translate everything spoken by both the human embassy and Olympus Federation, without making any mistakes. Though he had gotten used to his temporary translation facilitator role, he wondered why the old Dragonute that was also able to speak in the human tongue didn't turn into their translator. Little did Jason know that the old Dragonute was doing exactly that, proving that Jason was not deceiving them by sharing wrong information. He was a neutral individual as a halfling of the human race and another race, and thus the best person to become a translator in the current situation. However, at the same time, Jason could deceive either side if he wanted to, which was something they had to prevent. Setting up a wrong soul pact could bring forth devastating consequences. As such, there were always two translators, one from each side. Nevertheless, Jason was extremely bored, because the God's children and other prodigies were able to talk to each other, while he was forced to stay with the old people. Fortunately, his soul bonds were still there and Jason could see them playing around inside his soul world. This made him relax a little bit, preventing Jason, who was known for his impatience, from going insane. However, what astonished Jason was the fact that the God's children had grown more proficient in the universal language than he had previously estimated. It might only be a few simple sentences, but it was more than enough to start a simple conversation. In the end, creating the clauses for the first fundamental soul pact was not exactly difficult. They were making a peace treaty while setting up a business plan on how to strengthen Argos defenses from invaders. This business plan included the distribution of seeds to enter the broken world. Everything had to be properly set up, and a short discussion was not enough. As such, only a few clauses with the basic necessities that had been voted for unanimously, in the beginning, had been added into the contract. After the contract was roughly set up and every party had been able to add the points they found important, the official document was created. This was important in order to officially sign the proper documents at the celebration event that would be considered the end of this year's Liberation Tournament. At the same time, it would show every citizen of the Olympus Federation that the human race was now in a treaty, preventing both sides from attacking each other. For the human race, it was only a tournament, and the embassy wanted to take their leave in order to spread the news on Khania and the archipelago, but that was not the case for the Olympus Federation. As such, the human embassy couldn't simply leave, otherwise, they would come across as arrogant and rude. It was something extremely important to them, and the Olympus Federation wanted to celebrate their freedom, otherwise, their ancestors would probably be disappointed in them. Honoring those that had sacrificed their lives for the continued survival was only obvious, and even if the Liberation Tournament was held only once every 50 years, this was only considered a short time for those proficient in cultivating. Neither Jason nor the human race knew how long one could live by solely cultivating, but even the limits of the Lick stage were something that was far above 400, which was the uppermost age of the old ones of the human race who were still alive. In comparison to other races, the longevity may be short, but for the human race itself, staying alive for 400 years was a very long time. As such, 50 years were like a lifetime to them, while it was only considered a short amount for everyone else. While this fact was intriguing, Jason was more interested in the fact that he could talk with his friends before the celebration event would start. There were many things he wanted to do, but the most important was in fact, explaining to the God's children what he was planning to do. By that, Jason didn't mean freeing the Fleurs, or anything similar, but more that he wanted to destroy several world bridges before leaving Argos for good. Jason had thought about everything for a very long time, and he felt that it was finally time for him to take his leave. As such, he approached the God's children where Jared and a few other Olympians were also standing. Thus, he switched to the human language to talk to his friends. Jason didn't hold back in stating his opinion, and it was only 10 minutes later that he had finally stopped speaking. "So, you want to leave soon?" Betty asked, unsure of how exactly she should feel right now. On one side, she barely knew Jason, but on the other hand, it was sad to know that a good friend would leave soon. However, it was evident that Jason was held back by the density, purity, and amount of mana on Argos, as it was simply insufficient in comparison to what the God's children had heard from the other young prodigies. Despite not being able to speak many sentences in the universal language, their understanding of it was pretty good after having spent a total of 3 months inside the Olympus Federation. As such, everyone was aware that Argos was not only scarce of mana but also resources, with the most valuable resource being the living beings on the planet. Amongst them, the human race was probably the most valuable, simply because of their soul awakening that made most common, and even higher races jealous. Thus, the God's children supported Jason's opinion about the destruction of certain world bridges, while agreeing to leave those that lead to the broken world and other intersections of multiple races, open. As for the world bridge to the Myoldra, Bahrain, and a Phryta race, Jason hadn't told the God's children that he would imprint them into his mind. Once the time was right, he would return to their planet and find the culprits that caused his pain and agony of losing those that had been important to him. It was his personal vendetta. It might not be helpful, but at least he would be able to prevent history from repeating itself as long as he decimated those that had caused his sorrow. Even though Jared couldn't understand Jason, he knew that the young human would leave Argos soon. He, Xina, and a few other prodigies had also been told to leave Argos, but they had other preparations to do. Jason, someone at the initial rank of the second Lick stage, had defeated him easily. Because of that, not only was their pride shattered into smithereens but their mind had been cleared of pride. If I were to encounter a being with the same combat prowess as Jason, only at a higher cultivation base, my life would end before I can even think about running away. Jason could have easily killed every single opponent he had faced in the Olympus Federation, but he didn't do so. Instead, he had revealed his strength in order to clearly demonstrate that one's cultivation base was only the foundation of strength. He was a living testament to the fact that it could be further increased with martial art techniques, one's affinity, and many other factors that couldn't be figured out by solely looking at the cultivation base. After the official gathering had concluded, it was time to switch to the more important point of the entire day, the start of the celebration by handing out the rewards on the terrace of the Federation's building that could in fact be modified into a gigantic podium. Chapter 594, Second by Hydesgrain. Jason had no intention to waste more time, but he had to deal with it for now. Being disrespectful was not what he could afford directly after they had set up an agreement, and neither did he want to miss out on his reward. As such, he had to attend the celebration event that was held throughout the city. The highlight of the event was its starting point, wherein the rewards would be handed out to the first, second, and third rank holders. Jason didn't even know who the second or third rank holders were, but he followed the secretary who had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, only to tell him that he should come with him. Apparently, they were already a little bit late to start the celebration, hence the preparations had to be quickly rushed through. Under normal circumstances, the Liberation Tournament would have taken a few days longer, but because the authorities had changed the combat rounds into a battle royale, the entire plan had been discarded. It was only afternoon, and a few hours after the official meeting between the Olympus Federation and Human Embassy had started, yet Jason found himself in front of a huge crowd of citizens while standing on top of the small exquisite building complex where he was visible to everyone. Even though he felt that his surroundings had changed due to the crowd of people and the decorations that had appeared out of nowhere, Jason could only shake his head and try to look amused. Calmly waiting for the celebration event to start, Jason didn't even realize that Whis had appeared near the old dragon youth who could speak in the human tongue. As such, he didn't know that Whis was talking to the old man, telling him to translate something for the Human Embassy. The content of the translation astonished Merle and the human powerhouse, while the God's children looked at him in confusion. He might have told us that he wants to destroy several world bridges, but to think that he has his hands on the support of the Olympus Federation's guest, not bad. Betty was only mumbling quietly, but Merle glared at her before he averted his attention to the other God's children. You guys knew that Jason wants to destroy the world bridges. And you didn't think about informing us. Merle's reaction was obvious, considering that mankind would lose world bridges to several resourceful territories if Jason were to destroy them. However, that was not something Jason was bothered about because protecting mankind from the infiltration of hostile common and higher races was more important. He wouldn't be there next time, and instead of worrying about a few resources, Jason would focus on protecting the weak as per the promise to his master. Evidently, after looking at the state of things resulting due to the aftermath of the Great Argos War, the big families and clans couldn't protect the weaker citizens. As such, Jason decided to behave however he wanted. Nevertheless, what astonished almost everyone was the fact that Jason didn't want to do anything against the Drake clan. They had been equally bad to mankind as the Myoldra and Bahrain race, which made Merle and the other big clans' powerhouses believe that Jason would hate them. Yet, what these old men and women didn't know was the fact that both Jason and the God's children had found a way to terminate enslavement soul pacts. Jason may not like the Drake clan, but most of their powerhouses had been enslaved when they were young. As such, destroying, or weakening their soul pact by force would weaken the Drake family's combat prowess to a large extent. As for the rest, Jason decided to allow mankind to reign over themselves. He didn't believe that he could reign over the human race, and neither did he want to remain on Argos. Giving his best was, in fact, the only thing Jason could do for now, and Whis simply informed the Human Embassy about his decision to support the young halfling. Through this, he paved a way for Jason to leave Argos in the fastest possible time without creating too much of a commotion. 1 week should be more than enough. With my authority as a dragon and the correct technique, I should be able to destroy unstable world bridges, let alone the lowest ranked ones. Whis had enough time to make up his mind. His master's words were still ringing in his ears, and if he were to be honest, he was unsure whether Jason would remain as innocent and naive as he was right now. While fighting, Jason's entire demeanor was different, and Whis knew that the young man could kill without mercy. Yet, he had held back his urge to kill the young prodigies of the Olympus Federation, which meant that his mind was still stronger than his emotions. Thus, instead of wasting more time on Argos, he wanted Jason to meet his master, otherwise, he would have to bear responsibility for the young halfling's mistakes. This was the last thing Whis wanted to do because he had to focus on cultivating, which made him act directly against the human embassy. I hope the human race won't interfere in my business. Jason is now also considered to be my business. As such, tell the echelons of your race to stay out of our way during the short time we will stay here. These were the last words he wanted the old Dragonute, who was in fact a higher-up of the Olympus Federation, to translate. The Dragonute could only follow Wiss's order and sigh before he translated the last sentence. At that moment, Whis released some of his true dragon aura, highlighting the seriousness of his words before he left the dumbfounded human embassy alone. Merle was still staring at the god's children, his disappointment apparent, only to sigh deeply. Shame, Dalir, just what kind of monster did you two raise up? How can he worry about Argos, and the protection of the citizens who had never done him anything good, when he got the opportunity to leave with a true dragon? In the end, Merle could only assume that Whis was a true dragon because Jason had said so once. Meanwhile, another clue pointing towards this was the fact that the released dragon aura that was only a fraction of Wiss's true power had already been denser and purer than the dragons Merle had seen. While Whis had clearly stated his point, Jason stared at the representative of the Olympus Federation, who was standing in front of him and the other winner of the Liberation Tournament. They had gathered on top of the building complex, and everyone was cheering for them. Or, at least, for the other two winners. Jason was not sure what the Olympus Federation's citizens thought about him, but at least, they didn't insult him loud enough to be heard. Ignoring the long speech of the representative, he could only stare at the large table with several small and larger parcels lying on top of them. Through his emperor eyes he could clearly see that the object he had fought for in the Liberation Tournament was in the smallest parcel, the Lesser Origin Flame Crystal. While Jason was already excited, Solaris, who was still inside his body, could barely contain its excitement. Soon. Just wait a little bit. Solaris wanted to devour the Lesser Origin Flame Crystal right off the bat, but doing so right now could turn the entire celebration into an embarrassing event for the Olympus Federation, as it was not yet the time for Solaris to act. As such, Jason waited patiently, while repetitively instructing Solaris to calm down. Controlling the Black Origin Flame, he only noticed that the other two had already received a magnificent-looking badge in addition to their reward, and he was the last one. Finally, he thought while accepting the badge and the small parcel that had been given to him. At that moment, a firework set off, and Jason couldn't help but smile as he opened the parcel as he threw the orange crystal that felt warm in his hand, into the air. Go for it, Jason said in a quiet voice, before a huge maw of black flames and golden strands emerged from his body, issuing a thunderous roar. The maw turned into a gigantic dragon head as Solaris fused with it. The flames intensified as they enveloped the orange origin flame crystals that shattered with a loud crack. Chapter 595 Peace by Hydesgrain. Solaris erupted in an outburst of orange flames and had morphed into the shape of the golden-eyed black flame dragon. Seeing this, Jason couldn't help but smile, thinking that his soul bond was being extremely childish and a show-off. In fact, Solaris had taken a liking to the shape of beasts and loved imitating them. The golden-eyed black flame dragon was the most complex beast it had taken the form of so far. Knowing that the celebration event was something special, Solaris thought that putting up a grand performance and starting the event with a bang would be great. Jason's soulbond wanted his reputation to soar even further by making it seem as if a dragon was sealed inside his body, even if it was only the little black origin flame that devoured the unawakened lesser origin flame. Not only was its own reputation important for Solaris, but it valued Jason's even more, which was quite a ridiculous thought. However, the Origin Flames demonstration worked wonders as everyone cheered, with the young citizens screaming out in joy as they witnessed the fireworks and the appearance of the golden-eyed black flame dragon they had only seen through the holographic screen before. The representative of the Olympus Federation, who barely retreated a few steps after giving Jason his reward, was looking at the young man while shaking his head. He just feeds his Origin Flame with another one, why not awaken both and merge them? The old dragon youth had already been jealous of Jason because he had yet to advance his fire affinity to the extent of a common Origin Flame. Yet, Jason, who was way younger than him, not only had the black Origin Flame that was extraordinary, but he had also received his Origin Flame, the reward they had specially procured for the Liberation Tournament. It was the most expensive reward they had ever given out, and it was estimated to cost around the price of the first few Liberation Tournament rewards, added up. As such, it was only obvious that the old dragon youth's heart was hurting, and he was obviously not the only one. Almost everyone, who was not overwhelmed by the sudden emergence of the golden-eyed black flame dragon replica, had seen what Jason had done. Even Whis had found it intriguing, but instead of thinking that it was foolish, the young dragon stared intently at Solaris. Is its strength continuously increasing? However, before he could see the extent to which the black Origin Flame's strength had increased, Jason raised his hand. He called back Solaris, whose dragon head turned around, only to dive towards him, merging with the young halfling as if it was a daily chore. Yet, the commotion this caused couldn't be neglected, which made Jason smile lightly before he returned to the human embassy. While Merle was not sure if it was possible or even necessary for him to convince Jason in changing his plan about the world bridges he wanted to destroy, Betty and the other gods' children huddled around Jason, asking him all the different questions. This made Jason happy, and he decided to enjoy the celebration event for the next few hours. Nobody could tell when he would be able to have so much time to spend with friends and relax a little. He was going to enter different worlds after all. As such, while Jason had the best few hours in years, Solaris was continuing to devour the orange Origin Flame crystal. It had already made the first step, and the following procedure was simple, yet cruel for the unawakened Origin Flame. Devouring every trace of energy that was stored in the orange crystal, Solaris was slowly enlarging, breaking through its shackles, while consistently devouring the soul energy Jason had accumulated. A transformation was happening within Solaris' mana core, as the liquefied mana it had stored was slowly being compressed. The black Origin Flame had still a long time in front of it before it was even close to evolving into a Tier 2 Origin Flame, but that didn't mean it couldn't become stronger. Breaking through the shackles on it, Solaris' need for mana and soul energy increased drastically. It was about to create its first prismarine crystal within the mana core, but at the same time, it was annexing several soul crystals Jason's soul world had subconsciously created. The least Jason lacked right now was soul energy, and it had only increased further during the last few months. With tens of million soul energy units, in addition to a dozen soul crystals with each of them having used up 10 million soul energy units, there was no need to prevent Solaris in devouring as much soul energy as he required. In fact, Jason didn't even realize that Solaris was devouring his soul energy because he was too occupied in spending time with the gods' children. Merle had taken him away from the celebration for a short moment, asking him about his plan, which caused Jason to turn serious for a moment as he repeated his views about the world bridges. His stance was clear, and Merle noticed that it was not possible to change Jason's opinion anymore. As such, he nodded his head before returning to the other human powerhouses. They had to set up a plan in order to cope with the changes that were bound to occur due to Jason, but instead of being depressed about Jason's opinion, they felt that it was better this way. It was still possible for them to enter different world bridges, and their connection to the other continents and even more world bridges was established by Jason. With that in mind, there was no reason for the powerhouses to thwart Jason, which was not even possible anymore, to begin with. When the celebration event neared its end, Jason decided that it was time for him to bid farewell to everyone. Even if there was no need for him to rush anything, their separation was unavoidable. As such, he didn't want to forget anyone and regret not having bid farewell to someone. Jason felt at peace for the first time in a long time, and it was not necessary for him to fight anyone right now. The only tasks left were to procure information, save those that were important to him, and protect them by destroying all necessary world bridges. It might sound like a lot, but the things Jason had achieved during the last few years were even more, and each task had brought him further ahead. If he were to tell someone that he had barely begun cultivating 5 years ago, as well as received his vision, others would have called him a freak, and that was exactly what Jason was. In fact, he didn't believe that only 5 years had passed either. Initially, Jason expected the tasks at hand to be even more difficult than winning the Liberation Tournament, but after he had received Whis' offer, this worry had dispersed in the darkness of the night. At that moment, as if on cue, Whis appeared behind him as he looked at Jason impatiently. "Are you ready to go now? Let's destroy the necessary world bridges on the other continents first before you'll solve your other problems on Canir, or whatever the tiny continent is called." Chapter 596 Overwhelmed by Hydesgrain. Closing the world bridges with Whis' help was much easier than Jason could have ever expected, and their pace was terrifically high owing to Whis, who dragged him along. Using his dragon authority and shockingly high mana mastery, everything he did seemed like child's play, and Jason couldn't help but be jealous of Whis, only to realize that he was the last one to be jealous about someone like the dragon. Only 5 days had passed since the celebration event that honored the Olympus Federation's ancestors, but they had already fixed everything on the Federation's territory. This meant destroying the dangerous world bridges that were unstable and continued to gather mana before they reached their restriction limit, as well as those that had aggressive, hostile foreign races. The restriction limit was the biggest problem, and Jason thought that the world bridges that had a limit at the peak of the Prisma stage's first threshold, as well as some unknown world bridges with a growing restriction limit at the second threshold of the Prisma stage, were still fine. In the end, Whis had only destroyed a few world bridges as he thought that the unused mana could lead to a backlash on Argos, creating even more dangerous world bridges. Jason didn't want that, and it was only obvious that he had to prevent it at all costs. As such, instead of acting foolishly, Whis, who was not only more knowledgeable than Jason, but also more proficient in the necessary techniques to destroy low-ranked world bridges, took the lead. With the authority of a true dragon, combined with the correct techniques and perfectly applied knowledge, Whis had indirectly explained to Jason how he could destroy world bridges. Even though the young dragon was not fully aware of this, Jason had eyes that could see everything with the slightest trace of a cultivation energy. Whis only knew that Jason saw more than others because it was evident, however, nobody except Jason knew the true strength of his eyes. Now that 5 days had passed, it was time for Jason to return to Canir. Astonishingly enough, it took them only 5 more days to reach Jason's home continent, only for Whis to be displeased about their pace. However, that was not something Jason could change. He had already been using his fastest pace. There, he met Seren as well as Mike, his sister, and Anna. His encounter with each of them was brief because Jason felt as if he should hurry up in order to free Greg and Malia from their enslavement soul pact. As such, he did not have much time to talk with them, and only a few hours after he met Seren, he had already bid a final goodbye to his first friend from the big families. As for Anna, she seemed to accept his departure easier than expected. Instead of crying, the transmigrator had begun to take control of the toddler's body. Owing to that, she could act rationally, and had in fact, already started to cultivate. This caused Jason to wonder whether he and Anna would ever come across each other in the vast world. It was unlikely, but the thought of a chance encounter alone made him feel a little bit better. In the end, before destroying certain world bridges on Canir and the archipelago, Jason returned to the Drake clan's fortress that inhabited the entire regime of young potential powerhouses. Contrary to his earlier visit, he didn't disguise himself or act like someone he was not. Instead, with Artemis wings manifested on his back, he entered the fortress along with Whis, who had already released his dragon aura, as well as the mana fluctuations of a being at the peak rank of the Prisma stage's first threshold. There was no need for Jason to hold back anymore, and instead of playing around, his Emperor eyes sighted the two Flay siblings in an instant. They were currently training in the combat arena, and both Jason and Whis appeared above the combat arena. With a flick of his wrist, Whis destroyed the ceiling after manifesting a huge claw-shaped flame. Causing a commotion was exactly what they'd aimed for, but instead of attracting too much attention, Whis grasped both Greg and Malia after Jason pointed towards them before disappearing from their sight once again. A few seconds later, Jason had exerted the floating sky movement technique as well as his high physical strength that amplified Artemis wings in order to reach a terrific speed. After flying for a few kilometers, they landed on the ground as Artemis, in her largest form, manifested in front of Jason. At the same time, his wings dispersed as Jason remarked, "We should continue flying. Artemis' back is large enough to carry all of us at once." There was no time to waste on small talk right now because Jason was not sure whether the Enslavement Soul Pact would be activated soon. Thus, Malia and Greg, who were astonished to see Jason right next to a being that radiated a domineering and dreadful aura, couldn't help but feel confused. Yet, they followed Jason's order before Artemis ascended into the air once again. Whis was flying next to them, and with the siblings and Jason on Artemis' back, they increased the distance from the Drake clan's fortress. Meanwhile, Jason was explaining the situation as well as the way he had found to destroy the Enslavement Soul Pact. Greeting them properly and asking about their well-being was the second priority, and they could celebrate their reunion after everything had been successfully accomplished. This was more important to Jason because he was extremely nervous right now. He didn't want to make a mistake and cause an accident. Greg and Malia noticed how nervous he was. Due to this, they stayed calm as well. However, after hearing Jason, it became increasingly impossible to stay quiet. Greg blurted out his obvious astonishment. "You want to turn us into soul bonds so that you can order us to expel the engraved Enslavement Soul Pact from our soul." Greg had never been the smartest, but even he found this task to be unreasonable. Meanwhile, Malia looked at Jason in confusion. "And you've tested this, with a god's child's soul at that. Just what kind of soul do you have?" Malia was happy to see Jason, and hearing that he had found a way to successfully terminate the Enslavement Soul Pact gave her a ray of hope. As such, she readily accepted becoming Jason's soul bond for some time, thinking that they had no other way out of their misery either way. She missed her parents and was eager to see them once again. This hadn't been possible for the last few years, owing to her restricted freedom. With that being said, Malia had been trying to find a way to retrieve her freedom for a long time, which was possible with Jason's help now. Greg was still not sure what was going on. They had just been practicing a new martial art technique, and suddenly the ceiling above them was torn apart. Only a few minutes later, he found himself in front of his best friend, who asked him and his sister to become his soul bonds. Nevertheless, in order to protect his sister from harm, Greg was willing to be the test object to see whether Jason's intel was correct or not. Jason's aura was different compared to before, and many things seemed to have changed. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a dragon-like human flying right next to Artemis. With the siblings' permission, Jason didn't waste any time as he released two dense threads from his souls which he led through each of his arms. Holding out his hands, he told Greg and Malia to place their hand on either of his while accepting his soul thread into their body. Because Jason had already once overwhelmed the soul of a god's child that was at a higher cultivation base, Greg and Malia were child's play to him. They were not only at a much lower cultivation base but also had a weaker soul than Ben. Thus, only 2 hours passed in which Jason was slowly exerting his soul's supremacy over his best friend's soul. Jason found out that it would hurt them less if he was annexing them slowly, and the fact that it worked perfectly fine was an extraordinary find. If the God's children were to know this, it would be easier for them to terminate more soul pacts of the Drake clan, right? Yet, while thinking about that, Jason was not sure how many of the powerhouses that had been enslaved by the Drake clan would trust the God's children to annex their souls. Who knew what they would do once humans became the soul bonds of other humans? Under normal circumstances, this was not beneficial because the soul amplification didn't work with other humans, but for God's children with a huge soul, it might be possible to create an entire army of human soul bonds. Jason found this thought quite funny, but his mind was wired differently and he didn't need something like that. He would only accept beings that wanted to stay with him due to their own free will, simply because it was much more beneficial than the other way around. As for Greg and Malia, they had their own life, and Jason decided that they should live on Argos, and make their own decisions because they were competent enough to do so. Not long after Jason had established a connection with the siblings' soul world core, the link was strong enough for him to order his friends. With that being said, he took a deep breath as he smiled lightly before he released his Celestia aura and stigma as he amplified his voice, only to give his new soul bonds their first and last order. Destroy the enslavement soul pacts engraved on your soul. Chapter 597 Last Days by Hydesgrain. Several hours passed before the Flay siblings had expelled the imprints of multiple soul pacts from their souls. It was an arduous task, and it was only then that Jason realized that the Drake clan used several soul pacts in order to ensure the slaves' obedience. This was something he hadn't known beforehand, so he was astonished about it. Jason found this to be an extremely cunning tactic, but it perfectly suited the Drake clan's behavior. Nevertheless, it didn't really bother Jason anymore after the Flay siblings had been freed of the soul pacts that enslaved them. Their souls had been much weaker than the God's children, which made it easier for Jason to control his two new, temporary soul bonds, forcing them to expel their soul pacts in a slow manner. However, at the same time, he had to be careful so that he wouldn't accidentally injure their souls, which would be devastating. During the last few hours they had been flying in a specific direction, and Jason was growing nervous by the second. He was only glad that Greg and Malia were finally unrestrained, which allowed them to greet each other properly at last. Their second reunion was successful and Jason was proud of having saved the siblings. Now, they were about to return to Gabriella and Mark, who were said to be living an ordinary life in a small city. Both the siblings and Jason hadn't seen the two in a long time, which was the reason for Jason to be so nervous. It was to some extent his fault for the Fleurs' suffering. Despite that, he knew that he had to meet all of the Fleurs because it would be the last time for him to be able to do something like that. There wouldn't be a next time and Jason was fully aware of this. While Greg and Malia were looking at Jason as if he was an otherworldly being, despite knowing that he had changed during the last few years, they could hardly believe that their cultivation base and strength had been higher than him long ago. Jason's Celestia aura alone was already more than enough to suppress theirs if their friend desired to do this. Meanwhile, Artemis had also become much stronger, and every flap of her wings was filled with a distinct force as well as faint mana currents. Because of this shock, in addition to the book about Argos' insignificance which they had been reading only to figure out that it had been about Jason, they had been silent and reluctant to speak to him in the beginning. However, after Jason had revealed that he would soon leave Argos, both Greg and Malia were shocked. "We've just reunited, how can you leave already? Where are you going? When are you coming back? How can we meet each other again?" Malia seemed hurt as she bombarded Jason with questions, only to receive a dry smile from him. Jason didn't want to answer those questions, but looking at Whis, he knew that the young dragon was definitely not the patient type of dragon, if something like that existed, to begin with. He had received Wiss's help and letting him wait too long wouldn't do them any good. However, after he released a faint mana thread towards Whis with a simple question, Jason received an answer that was to his liking. "If you really want to stay longer with your friends, I can destroy the 4 world bridges you've been talking about before we meet each other again, but I won't wait any longer, and there is no room for compromises. Try to reject my proposal a few days later, and I will forcefully drag you through the world bridges. Wiss's answer sounded a little bit harsh, but the most important point was that Jason could stay with the Fleurs for at least a day. That was if Gabriella and Mark still accepted him under their roof. Jason didn't think that they would hate him, but it was possible for them to feel uncomfortable with a halfling around them. As such, Jason prepared himself for every possible scenario, only to be interrupted by Wiss once again. By the way, I won't destroy the newly emerged world bridge you were talking about. Maybe we can take a shortcut, if the world bridge leads us to the world I think it is. This astonished Jason a little bit because a world that Wiss remembered had to have something special about it. Intrigued, he could only stare at the young dragon, but instead of receiving an answer to any of the questions he asked afterward, Jason's connection was forcefully cut off by Wiss. Jason averted his attention after that, and he wanted to tell the Flay siblings what had happened to him during the last few years, only to halt in his tracks. They had already summarized their experience in the past years and shared it, and then heard him speak in rapt attention. When they had met the last time, there hadn't been enough time to tell them everything in a detailed manner, which was now possible. However, before Jason would have to repeat himself several times, Malia had proposed to wait before they had reunited with their parents. As they reached a small city, Artemis landed on the ground, only to change into her small form. At the same time, she returned to Jason's shoulder, and Petri, who had been digesting the information of the fusion he had undergone with Jason during the Liberation Tournament, appeared too. He was in his small form as well and had coiled himself around Jason's waist, which caused Malia and Greg to smile lightly. They felt a lot better since the Soul Pact imprints on them had been expelled. Jason had also terminated their soul bond contract, which had stung a little bit, but there were no major damages to their souls. Entering the city, Jason was eyed weirdly, which was nothing uncommon owing to 2 exotic beasts clinging to him as well as the Celestia aura and stigma. He didn't care about restricting them anymore, and this didn't seem to be necessary, to begin with. Wiss had already left before Artemis had dived back to the ground, and it was evident how impatient he was. As such, Jason felt the pressure from the young dragon, thinking that he did not have much time to spend with the Fleurs. Thus, without bothering about the glances lingering on him, Jason released a large margin of mana into the Emperor eyes while fully unleashing his stigma. A bright golden silverish glow radiated from Jason as he searched through the entire city, focusing on the mana fluctuations he was familiar with. It took him only a few minutes to find what he had been looking for, making him sport a radiant smile. I found them. With that being said, he set off and started to run over the sidewalk, with Malia and Greg following him, using their movement techniques to the fullest extent as well as the majority of mana they circulated through their bodies. Just like that, a few minutes passed, and Jason halted in front of a little house that resembled the house he and the Fleurs had been living in Syro City. Jason abruptly halted in his tracks with the Flay siblings close on his heels while taking lungfuls of air. Panting heavily, they asked in unison, "Couldn't you wait for us?" However, before they could continue to complain, they noticed that Jason smiled lightly in a particular direction as both Malia and Greg followed his gaze. Looking in the same direction as Jason, they saw a middle-aged woman, whose face was streaked with tears. "Mom." With that simple word, the Flay siblings rushed towards Gabriella, who couldn't contain herself anymore as she began to cry bitterly. Chapter 598 Reunion and Farewell. Jason felt a little bit weird seeing Gabriella once again, and he didn't dare approach them. Maybe they hated him for being the reason for their pain and agony. As such, he stayed rooted to the sidewalk, standing stiffly, while looking at the reuniting family. A faint smile could be seen on his lips, while his eyes revealed his insecurity that held a tinge of jealousy. It had been a long time since he'd felt insecure about something, and Jason couldn't help but feel uncomfortable right now. Only a minute later Mark appeared, and at the sight of his children, the usually emotionless middle-aged man began to sob like a 3-year-old as he hugged his 2 children tightly. More than 10 minutes passed before the Fleurs let go of each other, and Gabriella finally saw Jason as she lifted her head. He simply looked at her with a nervous smile without saying anything. Jason didn't expect Gabriella to be able to tell who he was because he had undergone a drastic transformation during the last few years. Yet, contrary to his expectation, Gabriella began to cry once again as she beckoned him. "Jason, why are you standing so far away? Come here." Somehow, Jason felt as if a train had hit him when he heard Gabriella's words that were filled with love and care. His eyes turned wet and a few tears trickled down his cheek as he answered, "I'm coming." It was only then that Mark noticed Jason, which caused his eyes to widen. He could sense Jason's mana fluctuations, the Celestia aura, and stigma. Everything about Jason was different, but Mark could clearly tell that it was the same Jason, who had been living with him for a long time, several years ago. Was the book really about the Jason I know? At that moment, Jason appeared right in front of Gabriella, who brushed her hair back. The speed at which he had rushed towards her astonished everyone, as they hadn't seen his full speed yet. Jason's aura enveloped the Fleurs, subconsciously radiating the joy Jason felt. As such, instead of feeling intimidated by his aura, everyone realized that he was still the same Jason they had known from before, only that the dangers of the last few years had forced him to mature. Only a moment later Gabriella embraced Jason tightly while patting his back. "You did a good job, you're strong now." Without realizing it, more tears trickled down his cheeks, and Jason could only hug back Gabriella as Mark patted his back, looking at him fondly. "You're a fine man now." Jason was not sure how much time had passed, but his tears had ceased when he loosened his grasp around Gabriella as Mark, who had regained his composure, said, "We should talk inside, I think everyone has lots of things to say." With that being said, Gabriella let go of Jason too before smiling at him. At that moment, Greg and Malia grasped one of Jason's arms before they dragged him inside, which caused him to smile despite the tears. Hours flew by and it was already late at night when everyone finished telling what happened to them during the last few years. Jason was not looked at weirdly because he was a halfling even once, and he felt as if everything was the same as years ago when he had first met the loving family. Because he told them that he didn't know how long he could stay with them, the Fleurs decided that going to sleep was not necessary. As such, they continued to celebrate their reunion as well as their farewell. The latter made everyone sad because they had just reunited, but instead of seeing everything from the pessimistic side, the Fleurs decided to cherish the time they would spend together and were sure that Jason might even be able to meet his grandparents. Jason had told the Fleurs almost everything without leaving out a lot. As such, they now had a fair understanding of his family's situation as well as the possibility of his grandparents being alive, while his father was some sort of a divine being. This was shocking, but the same could be said about the soul fraction of a mysterious, yet mighty being, sealing his bloodline. After you've met the master of the man who helped you take us with you, will you search for your father and your maternal grandparents? Do you have any clues about their whereabouts? Malia had matured a lot during the last few years, and she could think rationally without letting emotions cloud her judgment. She was sad that Jason would leave them forever, but it was only logical for him to leave. He was held back due to the low quality of mana on Argos and would soon become the strongest being on the planet, which was evident if Jason hadn't exaggerated the things he had told them. When Jason heard Malia's question, he pondered about it for a moment before he mumbled, "I almost forgot that I have to meet Nathan." Since their last meeting where Nathan had fumbled a little when Jason had questioned him about his mother and grandparents, Jason had always thought that Nathan had done something to his family, making them leave, or worse, hurting them before selling them to other foreign races. Because of their mana and emperor eyes in addition to the soul worlds they had, his family should have been worth quite a lot. As such, Jason simply assumed that a foreign race got their hands on his family. This was bad, but based on the words said by the mysterious being's soul fraction, his grandparents should still be alive. At least, that was the last thing it knew, which was reassuring. As long as I know which race my family was sold to, I can start investigating properly, but why do I feel like this is useless? Jason was not sure why, but he felt as if his family having been sold to some foreign race was definitely true, yet, at the same time, it was as if this knowledge wouldn't help him. The reason for this was extremely simple too. Why the hell should a common, or a higher race be able to make a tribute to the Celestia race? Even Lucen said that a grand race had ordered the Elva race to rescue me. And even that grand race was said to have received the order from Father's secretary, or something like that. Owing to this thought, Jason was utterly confused, and he could only assume that his family had been sold to another race as slaves or something similar, or that they had escaped from their clutches, fighting their way through the world. Either way, I'll just tell Whis that I need an hour, no, a few minutes with Nathan in order to find out the truth. After arriving at a decision, Jason's focus returned to the Fleurs, who were eager to find out more about him, which was only logical. Knowing that Jason would leave, they didn't hold back at all, and even Mark was interested to talk to him, contrary to how it had been in the past. At the same time, Artemis was perched on his shoulder shrieking, voicing out her joy, while Petri was coiled around his waist, hissing out in joy. Weirdly enough, even Solaris had decided to leave the Soul World, despite still being in the process of devouring the lesser origin flame that was less interesting than Jason had expected. He had hoped for something special to happen, but there was nothing. It had taken the shape of a miniature dragon with golden eyes, which looked magnificent, yet Jason couldn't help but smile helplessly. The Fleurs hadn't summoned any of their soul bonds, while his 3 soul bonds were clinging to Jason as if was going to abandon him too. However, when the Fleurs saw this, they couldn't help but smile, only for Malia and Greg's expression to change, knowing that one soul bond was missing. They had heard about Scorpio's death, but seeing all of Jason's soul bonds made them realize that it had been the harsh truth. How come he suffered more than we did, despite not being enslaved? Chapter 599 Submission by Hydesgrain. Unbeknownst to the Fleurs and Jason, the night had passed as they had spent their time talking and catching up with each other. Time had passed in the blink of an eye, and Jason didn't want his time with the Fleurs to end. At least, not that quickly. However, just at that moment, Whis's voice resounded in his mind. "I'm done, come out." Sighing deeply, Jason stood up with a twisted expression. This made the Fleurs understand that it was time for Jason's departure. As such, the mood plummeted, only for everyone, including Mark, to hug Jason tightly. "Maybe we will be able to meet again. It's possible that we will also leave Argos in the future." It was Greg who said this, but Jason knew that both Gabriella and Mark were not talented enough to survive outside Argos, while both Greg and Malia might have a talent strong enough to make everything possible. Jason just nodded his head, only to access his spatial rings, where he transferred several items into a 4th spatial ring he was holding in his hand. The 4th spatial ring held the last remains of mana stones and other, high-ranked equipment, in addition to body refinement and cultivation techniques that could be used by everyone. They were fully translated, and Jason hoped that it would be useful to the Fleurs as he laid down the spatial ring on the table that stood in front of him. Leaving the house, he looked back once before forcing a smile on his face as he waved at them. Artemis enlarged her form once they left the room, while Petri and Solaris remained by his side. Only a moment later Jason got on Artemis' back like she was demanding, only for her to ascend into the air. Jason continued to look back, only to see the Fleurs waving at him with tears in their eyes. Through his emperor eyes, he could see them for quite a while, and only when he was too far apart from them did he turn around to look at Whis, who hadn't said anything yet. Jason hadn't even noticed Whis all this while because he was too distracted. As such, Whis remarked. I have yet to take a look at the permanent world bridge at the second Prisma stage you've talked about. So we have to take a short detour. Hearing this, Jason got distracted from his train of thoughts as he replied. If we're taking a detour, let me talk to someone, for a few minutes. I have only one, or maybe two questions someone has to answer. Whis halted midair when he heard this, and Jason's emperor eyes perceived the surge of emotions within the young dragon as small flames erupted from his body, burning through the robe he was wearing. Jason gulped down his saliva nervously at that sight, only for Whis to take a deep breath before he retracted everything. Calm down, just think about the rewards. After we leave Argos, it won't take long before we arrive on Tagran and I can beat Jason up for every single time he annoys me thereafter. Regulating his emotions by using a specific breathing technique, Whis spoke with a forced calm. I'll give you 3 questions, but after that, I'll drag you away. Who the hell do you even want to talk to now? Jason was glad about Wiss's reaction, as the young dragon would have probably already returned to Tagran if it were not for him. As such, he didn't lie to Whis as he answered honestly. I want to talk to the person who probably sold my entire family to a foreign race several decades ago. As such, he could be said to be partially responsible for my existence, I guess. Jason tried to joke around with the last sentence, but after thinking about it for a short moment, he realized that this might as well be the truth. If his family hadn't been forced to settle in Argos after being sold or exiled, his mother would have never met his father, or at least it was highly unlikely. As such, Jason decided that he would ask Nathan a few questions without doing anything else to him. Interrogating him could already be tortuous enough as long as Jason used every means he had. Intrigued by his words, Whis nodded his head as he made a decision. All right, I'll come with you then. One day more or less makes no difference anymore. Jason was glad that Whis supported his decision after hearing the reason, and it took only a few hours before they reached the headquarters of the Heaven's Eyes sect. It was not even considered a detour because the sect's headquarters had been on their way to the new and permanent world bridge. Because of that, Whis felt even better, which made him release his dragon authority and aura as well as a huge amount of mana with which he simply destroyed the entrance. At the same time, he and Jason entered the sect nonchalantly, alarming the surrounding guards who couldn't move owing to the high pressure exerted by Whis. This was something Jason found quite funny to look at because he would have been forced to knock out everyone before he could meet Nathan. At least, that would have been the case under normal circumstances, but they didn't apply to the current situation because of Whis. Nathan sensed Wiss's aura as well as the impact of the attack on the entrance that serves as a warning, as well as Jason's mana fluctuations. Because of that, Nathan knew that the Liberation Tournament had already ended and that Jason seemed to have made a new friend. This was bad because Nathan had hoped that he would have more time to work everything out. Taking a deep breath, he took a look at the file that was lying in front of him with a single word written on the front page: Stellar. Knowing that Jason was a halfling, who was strong enough to put a powerhouse at the Prisma stage to sleep, as well as the fact that he was not allowed to kill him due to the public view of Jason, Nathan was forced to act differently than his usual self. As such, he had already prepared a file about everything that happened for Jason, out of fear to be annihilated in the future. It was his fortune that he had already done everything he could, and the only task he was now left with was to remain calm and level-headed in front of Jason and his new friend. Only a short time after they had entered the Heaven's Eyes sect, Jason and Whis appeared in front of Nathan, but the moment his eyes fell on the dragon, all the calmness flew out of the window as Wiss's authority enveloped him. Yet, at the same time, Jason's appearance was even more horrifying because he was using Petri's full fusion that amplified the lethality of the petrification and race-specific weakening curse. Other than that, Solaris was still in his small dragon form, which the little origin flame seemed to adore, only to hiss at Nathan, who was trying to not cower in front of them. Jason's wild aura enveloped Nathan, and despite being at a much higher cultivation base, Nathan couldn't help but retreat, submitting to Jason and the terrific strong friend he had brought along with him. Thankfully, I didn't kill them. With this monstrous partner he brought in my sect, I can only hope that he won't destroy my sect, or kill me. God's Eyes. Chapter 600 Anomaly by Hydesgrain. Even though Jason was currently fused with Petri, he didn't cover his head with scales, and instead, revealed his bright golden silverish eyes. They were consistently releasing the curses both he and Petri had, but Jason couldn't help but feel that this was not even necessary. Nathan was staring at him and Whis with a sliver of fear in his eyes, and the faint hue enveloping the Heaven's Eyes sect patriarch was also filled with fear. As such, there was no need for Jason to worry, so he said with a smirk, "Hello Nathan, long time no see. I hope I didn't interrupt your business." Hearing this, Nathan could only clench his fist while forcing a faint smile on his face. "Of course not, but how come you and your friend entered my sect in such an unordinary way? Is there a reason for this?" Despite knowing what Jason wanted from him, Nathan couldn't just show his fear and hand him the file in a submissive manner. As such, he tried to retain the last traces of his pride, while Jason came straight to the point. "My reason to come here is pretty simple, and I'm quite sure that you know why I came. How about you tell me what really happened to my mother and grandparents? I don't believe that they simply left the Heaven's Eyes sect, otherwise, my existence would be hard to explain, wouldn't it? Don't even try to lie, otherwise, it will be painful, both for you, and everyone around. As long as you remain truthful, nobody will be hurt either. That should be something to be happy about." Jason spoke in a barely controlled voice, not caring if Nathan's pride was tossed in the bin. All he cared about was knowing what had truly happened to his family. However, what Jason expected the least was that Nathan sighed before he handed Jason the file he had already prepared beforehand. "It's not much, but the most important point is that I sold your mother and grandparents to the Heva race, but that was already long ago, decades before you should have been born." Hearing the truth about his family's sale like a herd of goats caused Jason to involuntarily release his killing intent for a short moment, only to retract it immediately afterward. He had already guessed that something like that must have happened, and while skimming through the file, Jason noticed that the information was not really useful. Sold to the Heva race. While repeating Nathan's words in the universal language, he tried to recall the appearance of the Heva race, or to be precise, if he had ever heard of them. Unfortunately, this didn't seem to be the case, and Jason looked to Whis for help, who simply said, "They're just a common race with slightly stronger eyes. The Heva race is unworthy to come even close to the Celestia race." Whis was disappointed with the information he received because he could only understand what Jason said in the universal language. Despite that, the information that Jason's family had been sold to the Heva race was not exactly helpful either. This was because the Heva race had either sold off Jason's family to a third party, or they had somehow managed to flee from the Heva race's grasp and the planet. In the end, the information could be considered a clue, but at the same time, it could be compared to searching for a needle in a stack of hay. While Whis was disappointed, Jason just nodded his head before he turned around to leave. There was no need for him to ask another question because the file in his hand told him everything about his family's background, and there were even pictures inside. However, instead of leaving directly, Jason turned his head once more as he reprimanded Nathan, forcing his hands to stay on the sides and not punch him square in the jaw. "If you and the other human powerhouses are the reason for mankind to fall, I will send over people to decimate you, and everyone responsible for making a mess." It was not necessary for him to mention the names of the other human powerhouses, because it was evident that he meant the Drake clan and the Blood sect. He might be able to destroy them right now, but mankind would have to do certain things for themselves. Jason had just wanted to build a foundation for them so that they could work on their own to sow the seeds for a prosperous future. Because of that thought, Jason decided to leave for good. He had already wasted more than enough time on Argos, restricting his growth to a large degree. Nevertheless, Jason found that this wasted time only included his growth in terms of his cultivation base. If he had left Argos earlier, he wouldn't have been able to figure out about the ability to fuse with his soul bonds so early. Furthermore, it was unknown how long it would take to find an unawakened lesser origin flame in order to break Solaris' shackles. There were several other things such as encountering Anna, and finding out many important things about life as well as meeting Whis, who would bring him to his master, the Chaos Dragon, that had all been worthwhile to the time he had spent on Argos. Leaving the Heaven's Eyes sect's headquarters, Jason smiled lightly as he asked Petri to leave his mana core. Artemis wings manifested on his wings the moment she replaced Petri inside his mana core as he shot up into the sky. "I'm ready to leave now," he said, only to throw one last glance in the direction in which the Fleurs were now living. "I hope they can live a long life filled with joy," Jason mumbled before he noticed that Whis had already left his side. Sighing, Jason exerted the floating sky technique before he rushed after Whis. Only a few hours later, they arrived above the tiny island where the gigantic world bridge was situated. The world bridge really leads to mana. It has many world bridges leading to planets that are also connected with Tagran, but are you sure that a beast hasn't already appeared from it? Jason didn't say anything because he was not exactly sure about that, but from what he knew no beast had emerged from it so far. However, while staring at the world bridge, Jason's mind was recalling the coordinates to the planets of the Myeldra, Ephrata, and Bahrain race. He had watched Whis destroy them as they were amongst the first few world bridges on their list, and even if the world bridges had only led him to a planet close to the said race's planets, or territory, Jason would never forget their coordinates. There were things he had to accomplish there after all. Because Jason was deep in thoughts, he didn't notice that Whis was mumbling to himself while using his mana fluctuations to test out a few things. If not a single beast emerged from it yet, its location should be extremely bad, or simply unsuitable for living beings to survive. If that's the case, it will be extremely dangerous to use the world bridge, and we won't be able to take a shortcut, but it will become a detour. Whis tried to tweak the runes a little bit, trying to change the coordinates into those he was familiar with, to change the destination where the bridge would lead him if they were to walk through it. That was not possible with stable world bridges, but the one in front of them was still growing and extremely unstable. However, the moment Whis' dragon aura came in touch with the world bridge, something unexpected happened. Fuck. Jason leave. World bridges were still a mystery to most races, and those that knew about the truth behind them didn't reveal it owing to specific reasons. Yet, Whis knew that there were several types and grades of world bridges. Despite that, his eyes widened in shock as he witnessed what was happening in front of them. Was my aura already enough to cause an anomaly? Or was it just the spark igniting everything? Whis was not sure about the right answer, and he rushed back from the world bridge using his terrific speed. Only a moment after he had cursed, Whis perceived how the entire world bridge was slowly changing its dark blue color to a deep, crimson red. With the change of its color, the required mana to maintain the world bridge increased gradually, and Jason, who witnessed everything through his emperor eyes, could only gulp down his saliva as he flew back. Or at least he tried to. Flapping his wings wildly, he rushed back several meters, only to be pulled towards the world bridge as a ginormous suction force was released by it. At that moment, Jason's emperor eyes perceived drastic changes in the world bridge's runes, and he could only grit his teeth as he cursed. Shit.